Greetings to everybody who's joined us here for the webinar. We've got a really good turnout here, and the numbers I'm watching it's still ticking up. So welcome. I'm Randy Horton. I'm the Chief Solutions Officer at Orthogonal. Very briefly about us, in case you don't know who we are and you're just wondering who's putting on this webinar. We are here to improve patient outcomes faster. We're a software developer who helps medical device manufacturers accelerate the development of SaMD, digital therapeutics, and connected device systems. So we are very excited about this topic. In general, I think Orthogonal is very excited about sharing best practices with the industry and convening industry leaders for ideas. The truth is, I'll put it, is we could only work on a fraction of the medical device software systems out there, but my relatives are going to all need a much larger percentage of those. So the more we can help people come together and share good ideas, I think the better off we're all going to be, which is sort of our approach. It's a rising tide lifts all boats. So I'm welcoming you here on behalf of myself and Bernhard Kappa, who's the CEO of Orthogonal. This is part of a monthly webinar series we started last year that's been going really well. They've all been under the mantra of move faster and break nothing, which is sort of our motto for how we need to accelerate MedTech software development, as opposed to move faster and break things, because in our case, breaking a human being is what you would do if you're breaking something with a medical device. Our goal for these webinars is to give you some very practical gold nuggets that you can leave this webinar and put to use right away. So to give you either some new frameworks, some new ideas, some new things to think about, some new conversations to have. We try to make these very tactical. And what we say is that in the first 50 minutes, we will give you the core content of this webinar. So you want to come for your lunch hour, have it and leave. That's great. We will stay on through 90 minutes. So that'd be 1:30 Eastern time, and answer questions as long as people have them. And we've actually found on these webinars that about 40% of our audience is still with us in 90 minutes. Because we keep wondering, should we cut it short? But we keep getting questions all the way to the end. So today's topic is how do you definition and sizing of software as a medical device. I'm really excited about our panel for this. I think we're going to have a lot of good discussion here. But actually, as we got together and did a preparation for this, we said, you know what, we'd really like to actually hear right away from the audience what their questions are and what questions they want answered, because this is a big topic. It can be a little amorphous. So you have specific things you want us to hit. I know some people submitted it when they registered of questions, but send your questions now of what's success for you. And that can be a granular micro thing, or it could be a general macro topic, or a scenario if you want to lay out a scenario that you're concerned about and want us to address, and we'll do our best to hit on all of that. So with that, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. I'll give you a little bit of color about why I'm excited for them. First, David Fagan is a longtime leader in the MedTech industry, and I think has a unique resume, a relatively special resume in our industry, because he's been focused on digital innovation around medical devices and regulated devices for a very long time in a number of places, both with early stage companies and very large, very established kind of blue chip MedTech names. So he's got a pretty broad perspective, and he's probably, I don't know, David, could you tell us about yourself and how many devices have you worked on in your career that have software?
Yeah, it's a great question. Personally, probably somewhere between 5 and 10, 8, 9 or so. But I was privileged to have a number of teams reporting to me in various roles at Becton Dickinson, and even very early on at SimQuest, and then most recently before my current role at Boston Scientific. So I have my hand in many things, from VR, AR, AI, again, software specifically for diagnostics, digital diagnostics, Internet of Medical Things, connectivity, data analytics. So yeah, it's been quite a broad now, and even so, I would say that I know a small percentage of what it takes. So I'm also thrilled to be joined by Bob and Bernhard and you, Randy, here as well. So hopefully we'll get into some of the specifics.
Good. And it's true that every medical device you've ever worked on has been perfectly estimated within $1,000.
Pretty much, yeah. By the time that it got to market, everybody was happy that it was done. We'll just say that.
All right. Next up, I'm thrilled to introduce Bob Zimmerman, who's a solution strategist at Orthogonal. Bob's a longtime friend, colleague, former boss, collaborator again. And Bob, I will give the preface. He's not a deep med tech person. He's relatively new to this industry, though he's worked in healthcare. But Bob has one of the most impressive breadths and perspectives on software definition and sizing in general across many industries, because I can tell you it's a challenge in our industry, and we have unique reasons why, but there's a lot of patterns that appear over and over in every industry we can learn from. So Bob, with that, anything you want to add?
No, you said it all. It's my focus is product definition and sizing, and coming up with some tactical, like, best practices that you can apply immediately and see a big difference in getting people to support your project.
Bernhard, you want to introduce yourself and explain why you left all these other non-regulated industries to focus solely on medical device and SaMD?
Yeah, so I started out my career outside of the medical device space. Have loved what you can do with software and how quickly things evolve and how much you can leverage the work that other people have been doing to build great software on top of the software and hardware that other people have done. And love that outside of the medical device industry. And then at some point, through a client of ours that moved to a medical device company, ended up being exposed to the medical device space. And I loved the purpose there, but some of the ways that things were being done weren't taking advantage of modern best practices. So my journey has been, how do we bring those evolving modern best practices into the medical device space so we can improve patient outcomes faster with this work. And that's been an interesting journey over the last 12 years. Have learned lots of new things and built some great products, and continue to learn along with the industry on how to deal with the fact that software is eating the world and every company has to become a software company.
Thank you. Well, welcome to all of you. I think everybody on the call, our side and all of our attendees can agree, software projects aren't easy. MedTech software projects aren't easy. SaMD software projects aren't easy. And there's probably, frankly, a lot more worst practices than best practices out there. I actually came across a t-shirt I'd seen a while ago, but I came across it yesterday. I said, oh, I got to pull this up and share this shirt, because I think in many ways, this defines where a lot of things could go off the rails. I'm hoping this gives everybody a good chuckle for me. I'm going to share this. Weeks of programming can save you hours of planning. Send a note in the chat box if you identify with that theory, that it's easy to get going and then to get lost in the work. So why are these things hard? Why is software hard generally? Let me throw that out, to all of you, and then let's hone in on why is SaMD and MedTech hard uniquely.
So I'll jump in and sort of maybe change that question a little bit. I don't think that software is particularly hard, or at least not harder than complex biological medical devices or capital equipment, or things that actually can do some very, very rapid direct damage to patients. So I don't think it's so much that software is inherently hard, although it is very complex and multifaceted and very linked. I think that it's really the expectations that software is easy that sort of makes it appear that software is not as easy as people expect, and therefore it's hard. Now that's sort of a very high level view. I'd say when you get more granular, I think some of the challenges with software as a medical device are that it's not it's very easy to create features and functionality that do wildly and vastly different things. And when they do those wildly and vastly different things, right, you trigger novel regulations and compliance requirements. You might go from sort of the realm of being a simple fitness app into all of a sudden you're a class 2 medical device, with one change of in a line of code. So that's why I think, this question in and of itself is really, really important. How do you sort of define and size, which really implies how do you figure out what it is that you're doing and the implications of that? That's why it's so important to kind of know the ballpark you're playing in early and know when you're kind of getting outside of that ballpark throughout the process of software development. I think other people like Bob and Bernhard are probably even better positioned to talk about some of how you actually do that.
Bernard, did you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think, one reason why software is hard is because it's so easy. I know that sounds like an oxymoron or a contradiction, but really the fact is you don't have a production line. You don't have all of these things that you have to do for hardware. It's very easy to incrementally add features and outside of the medical device space deploy them. So you can get in something that is incredibly complex, something that you would not, that you would realize how big and complex that is on the hardware side, because you have to think about all those things, and you can creep into something like that if you don't know exactly what you're doing. Once you add both the medical device regulations, but potentially also, the needs of getting clinical evidence, and how your software might need to be different for a clinical trial or a pilot, or having shams for your software. All those things are additional things that add sort of complexity to this, that add restrictions and kind of are different than how you would deal with software development outside of the medical space.
Bob?
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm asking you.
So, I'm going to give you an answer that's a little bit different. I think in looking at the prep questions, a lot of you sent in a lot of questions ahead of time. They really focus on, how do I do certain SaMD things with the software? Certain connectivity or predict risk around it. And a lot of these questions actually are saying, how do I prevent this from being hard? Because if I can do this planning and do this investigating, I'm sort of 3/4 ahead of everything else, right? 75% down the field, if you will. I'm going to give you what I found to be the Achilles heel of product development. And this is true for any product development, not just SaMD, but it certainly applies in the SaMD world more critically. And it's simply alignment. Are we talking about the same thing, right? So if somebody says, I want to create a software app for a Bluetooth device for like blood pressure cup, right? And we've been on sales calls. I've sat in and trying to help create the solution strategy with Orthogonal, where somebody will come up with that, and there'll be a very easy question. So, what devices do you want to support? Right? And they'll say, well, iOS device, Apple. Let's leave it like that. And it's like, okay, current devices. Do we want to go back 5 generations? Are we going to focus only on certain versions of Bluetooth? And a lot of times people go, I haven't thought about that. What I can tell you from experience is a lot of times people haven't thought about that, and they already started coding. So they already started planning how they're going to classify the software. They've already started planning design. They've already done their Figmas, their UX, but they still haven't come up with that answer. And then a question comes up, well, if a new version of Bluetooth comes out, do we support it? And literally in the same moment, 2 different people in the leadership team will say, One will say absolutely, and one will say, well, we can't. Right. And I'm sure that's happening with our audience right now. Half of you will say, well, of course, we're going to have to stay competitive in the market, while the other half is saying, but if we filed and we created our risk analysis according to just this version of Bluetooth, I don't even know what I don't know about a newer version of Bluetooth connectivity. So I can't. Right. So coming up with what is a common definition of success, I would say, is one of the key things that people forget to do before they start. Right. And if you can do that for the definition, come up with, how do we know when we're done? Let me give you a more specific example of what does Bob mean for a common definition of success, or how do we know when we're done? How do we know when we tell the developers, hands up, like one of those cooking shows, hands up, step away from the table, we're not doing any more coding, we're shipping, right? And we're not tweaking any more features or making usability any different, we're done. What is a definition of success? That would be my focus. Sorry for the long babble.
No, that's, I think it's a great point, Bob, your perspective, which is if you don't even agree on what you're trying to accomplish, or presumably why you're trying to accomplish it, right? You know, what is the goal of the company? Forget the device. What is the goal of the company? Where does it need to be? Does it need to have this release? Does it need to have this evidence, particularly in our space, because it's not just alpha, beta, launch, right? There's so many different moving components that you need to knock out. David, when we had our prep call, you had an interesting kind of, I think, comment on this, which is, yes, that's all good, but if you don't know what you don't know, and you're very much in an R&D mode, it's hard to have a definition of success, because you kind of, what is it? Tell us, are you still figuring out the problem? Are you still figuring out what the solution is? Can you talk a little bit about the dimensions of that in our space?
I think you got to pick the right tool for the job. And the right tool, I mean the right kind of process, even the right mindset for the right job, right? If you know exactly what you are building, why you're building it, who all the users are, what the impact is going to be, you know that it's going to be a class 2 SaMD digital diagnostic, and you've either proven it out, or you've done the clinical trials, and you've done the user testing. So now it's just a matter of like building, getting to regulatory, pushing it through, figuring out commercialization, blah blah blah. You can do a lot of planning that'll get you pretty close to the mark. But it's an entirely different world if you're actually trying to do sort of digital rapid innovation, where, not only maybe what you are building is going to move from, health software into a class 1 device, maybe touch on a class 2 device, maybe kind of go back, and you have no idea, even once you're sort of in the market, if it's going to work. Then what's absolutely critical is maintaining flexibility, thinking through kind of the key hypotheses that you're trying to address at each point. So it becomes a lot less planning and a lot more about, what's the hypothesis that's going to kill this opportunity, and how do I prove that as quickly as possible? And I think there you're really talking about flexibility, right? And thinking through, how do you make things much more granular. Now, eventually, if you have to submit to the FDA and do V&V and get it, approved, obviously those are going to be longer cycle iterations. But in my mind, the most important thing is really teasing apart what is known, what is unknown, what are you sure about, what are you not sure about, and treating it with a kind of complete realism, right? If this is if the FDA has never approved, an AI in this space for doing that particular thing, well, your assumption that it's definitely going to take 6 months for them to approve it is probably off, right? It's a new pathway. There are lots of unknowns, and it sort of gets. There's a question in the chat I was also looking at about sort of quality systems and quality processes that's really not unrelated, right? One of the challenges I think with a lot of modern quality systems is that they don't accommodate the unknown unknowns, right? Or even the experimental unknowns, the things that you're running experiments to try to figure out. And so what we, and I think you and I, Randy, were on a call not too long ago where there was one company that was actually leveraging 3 different quality systems across their organization in order to deliver, one digital health feature. And I think that is, well, let me say that it's that approach is actually better than using, a class 3 medical device process for a simple standalone, feature. On the other hand, that maybe wouldn't be a class 3. On the other hand, if you actually don't have a quality system that can sort of accommodate this iteration experimentation in the software realm, you're really not, you're just not going to get to this goal of digital innovation and iteration, right? Obviously, there's always this kind of core component of SaMD that's that has to be locked down and verified and tested and everything else. But success for the product isn't just going to be that core lockdown component. It's going to be the entire product, right? It's going to be multiple features, functionality, engagement, maybe even simple surveys that kind of go all around that product. And you need a lot of flexibility in terms of that quality process. One of the things that I've done was really worked very, very hard in every organization I've been in to sort of revamp those quality and regulatory processes in order to enable that innovation and specifically around digital innovation.
Yeah, I think obviously understanding what is, what the constraints are that you have around a particular thing and how those constraints might evolve, right? Just because you're, as you say, just because you're a not classified as a medical device now, that does not mean that, 6 months from now or a year from now, you're not going to have features that either by necessity move you into something that has to be regulated, cleared by the FDA, or that you want to because now you can prove certain things with that, and there are reimbursement, and sales and marketing consequences as a result of that. Commenting on what you said in terms of your ability to iterate and innovate around that, I think one of the key things we always look at there is, when we know that there is medical device functionality, being very clear what the boundaries of that functionality is and what else is in the system and what that interrelationship is. It doesn't mean we only do design controls on the medical device portion. We have to, if there are dependencies, we want to make sure that we're dealing with those correctly. And that typically involves understanding residual risks of those other subsystems, even if they're outside of the medical device, as long as they impact the medical device. But those are the ones you can much more quickly iterate through and experiment, shall we say, as opposed to the parts that are where there's patient risk in the medical device space. So that helps in terms of thinking through the level of effort you have to do for design controls, for testing, for risk mitigation, which could be much more substantial for class 3, let's say, than for class 2 or for software safety classifications that are higher versus lower.
That is an absolutely critical best practice when you're doing SaMD and digital health innovation. Could not agree more. It's not. It's, as Bernhard will say, it's not easy to define that SaMD course so clearly and put the right sort of boundary constraints on it to know right when you're impacting the risk. But it's absolutely critical in order to get to a product that's useful.
So there's a question here that I think it's a great next one from this, which is all these things the three of you said we got to get our arms around or try and do, but that's like a giant ball of mud. So the question was, how do you avoid analysis paralysis? Like, how do you actually execute this in a tactical, practical way that actually gets you to a definition and sizing that's complete and thoughtful, but not an 8-year process?
I mean, look, I would say you have to recognize where you are in your process. Are you at a point where, anything more than, ballpark sizing makes sense? Are you really just in the process of figuring out, is there a there? Is there a viable product? Is there a good problem that I'm solving? Does my solution make sense? All of the sort of lean startup types of things that you do for hypothesis testing. Or are you at the point where you have a good idea on this is something we're going to submit to the FDA, and we need to, build and get this product to market. Those are two different phases. If you're still in R&D and sort of looking at technical risks, you're looking at, market feasibility, reimbursement, all those types of things. It's probably premature to do kind of the level of rigor that you would do to actually build the product, right? But then you better do it. You better get alignment, because that's when you start spending real money, right?
So again, 100% agree, Bernhard. In that early stage, analysis doesn't get you anywhere, right? Experimentation is what helps you learn and really define and understand. And every time I've been through this process, kind of putting your money, and your effort where your mouth is, obviously not by launching a unapproved SaMD, but there are so many hypotheses you can test. There are so many things that you can do in terms of the value, in terms of the clinical impact, in terms of the 100 that will help you actually define what the SaMD that you need to build is. And then, as exactly as Bernhard said, look, then you got to buckle down and do potentially the clinical trial and develop it in a way that's compliant.
Bob, you were smiling. Sorry, I was going to unfairly ask you what you were smiling about.
So it's interesting because in the answering, how do you avoid analysis paralysis? You could get in very easily into analysis paralysis, right? This has been a topic that's come up many times. So there are two things that I would say that are practical. And one is my way of summarizing what Bernhard started saying. There are two phases to product definition, to engaging on anything. Because if you're in the middle of testing something, analysis paralysis is different than if you're in the middle of designing it, right? So at the highest level, there's a concept called discovery versus definition. Discovery is, I don't know where I want to go. I'm going where no man has gone before. I'm discovering what is it that I want to bring to market. And if I don't have that completely defined, there's some things that definitely need to be completely defined. There's some things that if I don't define until later, it's okay. And having clarity around what do I need to be defined before I move into definition, doing Figmas, etc., right? Having clarity on what you need defined versus what you don't, and don't let people combine the conversations, because that's where analysis paralysis happens. There's another way that people that have worked with me get annoyed by me, but they always thank me at the end. So I think that's a good thing. Separate what and how, right? So many times we get into a conversation and it's like everybody goes down into this freaking rabbit hole and they're so focused, like, what devices do we want to support on this, blood pressure cup versus an app, right? Well, let's talk about the different types of Bluetooth. And they actually start discussing 5 different flavors of Bluetooth and edge cases. And as a leader, I'm sitting here going, this is all good. You're talking about how this stuff works. All I want to know is what. And so here's the easiest way to spot analysis paralysis that could be cured with separating a conversation about what you want to do separate from how it's going to work. And that is, are you talking about nouns or are you talking about verbs? Action. How is all about action. Nouns are about what, right? So what devices are we going to build is different than, well, how do these devices work? And how am I going to connect into them? I need to understand the how, but the conversation here is about the what. If somebody needs to go offline and discuss the hows to come up with an answer, great. But separate it out and you can start undoing analysis paralysis. It's basically putting the boundaries on team collaboration. Hopefully that's helpful.
Let me ask a question to dig in and make life a little more complicated. So if you're building a logistics system, that sends shipments of things from point A to point B, from the warehouse to the store, right? Or your house, and you say what and how, I think it's pretty clear what the what is. There's a box here, somebody's got to pick it up, they got to move it over there and drop it off and get confirmation or something. In our space, there's another layer to that, which is we don't know that if you move the box from here to there, it's actually going to change the human body, right? There's medicine and science underneath of, does that actually?
So let me give you a practical example. And in the SaMD space, this actually doesn't hold perfectly true. So I'm going to apologize to the entire audience. So somebody's writing the idea of a device and they're doing the blood pressure cuff. I'll stick with that example. And they're basically saying, I want to review a 14-day trend. And if it goes beyond this % deviation, I want to notify the patient on a 14-day trend. Notification, I want to notify the patient. That's a what? So are we going to send them a text? Are we going to create an app alert? Are we going to send an email? Are we communicating it to his doctor? Communicating to his doctor is a what? Is his doctor going to get the notification? How we do it, whether it's a text or in an app, in some circumstances, that's really important. It could be a competitive differentiation. And other differences, somebody gets to say, let's not worry about that. We're going to basically say you can do all the above. We'll figure it out later. But the key is we're going to proactively notify. Now, if let's say you need a notification while you're doing the collection of information, that notification, knowing how it's going to work, is critical, right? Because it actually refines the what you're doing. So it's not always black and white, but that's an example of the what is the notification, how the notification works. Do we care? Is it really critical to define right now? And I know in SaMD, 99% of the time you need to know the how because it affects filing and all the classification and all the other stuff. And that's why there are wiser people than me on this call.
So David, let me give you an example, building on what Bob said, and let's see if this holds. And if this example doesn't hold, we'll just disregard and tell me a better question to ask. Say somebody comes to you and says, I've developed a new transdermal method for delivering insulin, for people with diabetes. But my innovation is I figured out there's actually 4 different spots in the body where you could put those patches. And if you can titrate and microdose which part of the body you're delivering insulin to when, based on signals you're picking up from the body, I think we can deliver a fraction of the insulin and actually get much better quality. Now, there's 2 ways they could come to you with that. They say, I have an idea that I think if I could microtitrate, right? Or I know I can microtitrate, but I think if I could figure out the algorithm for how to deliver it, we could do it, as opposed to saying, I've got an algorithm and it works. How do we get this attached to, new insulin delivery systems? How do you look at sort of where they stand clinically and whether or not they know if they have medicine that works, as opposed to, even in theory, like if somebody's completely compliant, we know it works. Now, can we get somebody to be completely compliant?
Yeah, I would say, putting myself in that situation, I would say, show me the proof, right? And yeah, if you really did the clinical study to demonstrate, you really, again, in this space, you don't believe anybody, right? I don't believe that I don't believe that your algorithm works. I don't believe that your data. I don't believe that it's meaningful, and tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars have been lost when people do believe and don't ask those nuanced questions about the even if you conducted experiments, if they worked. So so how do you actually do it? Like, how do you scope that? But I think you scope a hypothesis at a time, right? And you scope sort of that in a lean startup way, and you say, well, is it, if I inject here, this happens. Well, let me run a experiment, probably an animal model where I inject in two different places, and obviously you have to vet the animal model and have to make sure that that's a corollary in a whole. But you have sort of this very, very defined cadence, and toward the end of the development, right? Or I would say past, it's almost like a event horizon, right? After that initial experiment, like it could go one of 5 different ways, and either I'm going to be a billionaire or I just wasted 3-4 years of my life. Now that's why you have the VC model, right? You put in a lot of bets, and you hope for the 100x exit, because you know you're going to lose money on 50 of them. And people make a lot of money, and a lot of very smart people lose a lot of money on doing things like that. So I just think it in my mind, it all goes back to figuring out the hypothesis, figuring out, if you prove it, what is that incremental value, right? Because that it does have, even the basic animal experiment is going to have huge incremental value. The valuation of your company goes to 10x, because somebody will believe, and eventually you have a shot at becoming a $10 billion business. But it really is you got to get through those types of milestones.
But are
Yeah,
you
I think
saying that some of the principles about definition, sorry, we're going to run one follow-up question quickly. The principles for definition and sizing can be applied at every stage, define and size your animal trial, and use some of these same concepts along the way?
Yes, to a certain extent. Yeah, you have to think about the value that you're creating at each step, right? And the value that you're creating is going to require some investment. And obviously, even the early stage investments in some of these things are far from trivial. So you want to think through, what can go right, what can go wrong, what's known, what's unknown, what is the fastest way to get there, what, and even in animal trials, obviously there are regulations that you're going to have to go through. So yes, there is definition and sizing there, but you don't get into sort of the analysis paralysis, because you have clearly defined what is unknown and what you're going to do to make it known.
Yeah, I think the concept, or some people call this kind of, getting up the evidence curve, right? You start and you do smaller, cheaper experiments to validate things, and then you get up the evidence curve. You need more money typically to later on to get that evidence. In some cases, right, what you can do is it's actually really easy to generate evidence. In some cases, you have data that you can compare to, you can do benchtop testing, those types of things. That's a lot easier than if you have to do a clinical trial. Your cost of the clinical trial is often, and the time frame involved with that, compared to your product development and software development, it could dwarf the cost of your product development, or at least be equal to that. So understanding what evidence you need to generate is going to be, a big factor in the overall, overall product sizing, right? How long it's going to take and what the cost is going to be and how long you have to wait, in between different things, right?
But, just opportunistically, I think we should just answer one of the other questions that came in. How does the medical device get into clinical guidelines? I think the answer here is evidence, right? You prove that it's better than the current standard of care. You prove that it's either, a frontline or this. You have enough thought leaders back your play. You do enough clinical studies. It creates a groundswell, and then you create, good, high quality, evidence-based noise around your product, and then you lobby the clinical guidelines developers. What what becomes interesting is that there's an incredible amount of nuance there, because there are, unfortunately, in healthcare, there are incentives for those clinical guidelines developers that are not, well, I'll put it this way. If you had a, instant pill that fixed your knee, without, a big surgery, you would probably have a hard time getting the orthopedic society to say, hey, this is the medical, I should have said medical device, but a pill that you should take instead of, this multi-billion-dollar industry. So you have to pick the right organization that is aligned both with the outcomes and, honestly, the interests of that guideline creator, that community.
And then the additional complexity is, of course, hopefully, in many cases, your business model is getting reimbursed, or someone getting reimbursed for use of this, as opposed to something that you're selling directly to consumers. While those exist in this industry, that's a whole nother set of evidence. Just because you got FDA clearance does not mean you're going to get reimbursement for that. And that can be different between CMS, private insurers, or self-insured large companies, right, as well. So that's another part of the thing that you should, obviously, if you're thinking about that total life cycle, that you have to take into consideration as part of this. In some cases, it's worth, if, as you're thinking about what your product looks like, what evidence and data can you build into your product itself and or the ecosystem around it, then you have to do kind of, trade-off analysis. How expensive is it to do that? And is it worth it to do that rather than put everything into a clinical trial?
The health economics and outcomes research that Bernard is discussing is absolutely vital to the adoption of a product. Well, I would say that there are two categories, right? One is the super expensive device that either gives you a couple more years of life, that's super differentiated, maybe doesn't and costs the health system and everyone more money. Those are still very viable, right? Like, people pay for quality of life and length of life, no question. But the other spectrum, hey, this device, this treatment, this therapy actually reduces the overall health system costs. That is finally, after 20 years of 15 years of value-based care, really becoming very, very important. There's a very interesting dynamic. I don't know, maybe this is off topic, but it's a super interesting dynamic, right? Because payers have always been incentivized to save money, to drive the value, as opposed to just more expensive procedures. What's happening these days, though, and at the same time, physicians are always saying, I don't care, I just want to do more procedures. The more implants I do, the more money I make. And yeah, everybody gets an implant, everybody gets the digital therapeutic or digital diagnostic or whatever. But these days, the payers are so aggressive in their structuring of kind of at-risk contracts, and even directing patients away from physicians that may be delivering very, very expensive or even somewhat unnecessary care. that those physicians who formerly used to say, I just want to do more procedures, they're going to start getting hit in their pocketbook. They're just going to start seeing less work from the payer. So these days, just going full circle here, the health economic impact and benefit of your device or digital devices is incredibly important these days.
So because we're coming up at the 12:50 mark, and I did want to promise we'd hit all sort of the core content, there's a method, some methods you guys keep referring to, which trace back to a book, which I know has been very influential on at least two of your backgrounds. So I wanted to pull it up and have you maybe explain why it's worth reading and what it tells you, and then how you might adapt it a little bit to our industry. So The Lean Startup by Eric Ries came out a little more than a decade ago, I think. So what was the aha moment for you? Because at least Bernhard and David have both referred to methods that came out of this several times here.
My aha moment didn't necessarily come from that, but it came from Steve Blank's work. That Eric Ries is a student of Steve Blank's, and so Steve Blank wrote initially the 4 Steps to the Epiphany, and then the entrepreneurial handbook. I forget what the later one is called, but really they all talk about the same things, right? Is that there are really, for any business, 2 stages, right? One is the search for a business model, and then the other is the execution of a business model. And that the skills you need and the methods you use for each of those is different, right? And people misapply execution when what you really need to be doing is searching rather than executing and exploiting. So yeah, for me that was, it makes total sense, and I know I've made that mistake before. And so if you treat it as such that what you're doing really is thinking about your potential business models and the pieces that make that up as hypotheses that you want to test, it's a method for de-risking and a strategy for that search process.
Spot on, and Bernhard has had much more experience in this and started much earlier than I did. For me, it was really an epiphany, and the epiphany came. I had my first job after business school. I basically drove a large digital health strategy for Becton Dickinson around smart medication management broadly across the company. I spent years sort of figuring out what is this strategy. Talk about analysis paralysis, right? Where is every startup? Where is every this? What's the possibility? What are the clinical challenges? Like literally years of doing this. And when I went back and realized that probably 90% of the assumptions we had about the conclusions we had about what would work, what wouldn't work, were not so much wrong, but almost like irrelevant. Like that's just not the important thing, or that's not going to solve the core problem. That combined with the fact that I read Lean Startup, and it just completely opened my eyes in terms of this idea of what is that immediate hypothesis? What is that? How are you kill the opportunity? What's the most important thing to basically try to kill the opportunity or the feature or the function or whatever? And if you can't kill it, great, then you move on, right? And you run that experiment as cheaply as you can. So it was a Lean Startup, and then it was a Startup Way, which I was in a big corporate at the time when I was reading these, and the Startup Way is really the application of Lean Startup into large organizations. And the real epiphany there was something like this. Our company, all these large companies, have an incredibly hard time investing large sums of money, which they're used to investing, but in innovation, right? So they can do a $10 million project for a medical device. They can invest $20 million in an IT kind of structural revamp because it'll drive, $5 million of savings or $25 million of savings. But when you say, give me, a couple of $1,000,000 to try to change the world and save, whatever, tens of thousands of lives, they really struggle because there's no way to value that. And what I realized that with this lean startup approach, what I could do is not ask for 2 million and put sort of that much money and funding and time and leadership attention at stake, at risk, but I could ask for 50 grand and then come back, not in 2 years, but come back in a month and share my learnings, right? And I realized that there isn't a single leader out there that wouldn't say, yep, here's your 50 grand, do 3-4 weeks of work, tell me what you learned. And I realized it was an absolutely amazing way to unlock innovation, experimentation, insight in a large company. Now, at the end of the day, it's still going to take, a year and a half to run enough experiments and to build sort of that evidence scaffold and proof points and everything else. But at least in these large organizations, it's a way to get started down the path where a lot of things are really unknown. And by the way, like we applied lean startup toward then we were applying lean startup to IT projects, right? What is the minimum fastest way I can generate meaningful value for by introducing some kind of tech. In fact, we got so advanced that our vendors struggled to keep up with us. We kept saying, they kept wanting to pitch us these $1 million deals. We said, all right, give us the first little module, show value, then next month we'll buy another one, another one. And we would actually select vendors to do this. But my point is, like, this thinking, I honestly think that there's even an application of this thinking that's critical to doing SaMD, right? The simplification, the immediate focus, the hypothesis driven, like anything can be turned into a hypothesis and experiment. Incredibly powerful framework.
Do you find that, one quick question to close this out, and then we can keep going, but I want to make sure we kind of wrap this in a bow. And I want to ask each of you if you have a closing statement for somebody whose lunch is over, they're putting stuff in the garbage can, they're moving on. Well, I guess nobody does that at home anymore. You just put the dishes back in your sink. Do you find that in a MedTech organization, because we're so grounded in evidence, that executives inherently get that idea that you're creating business evidence cheap and quick?
From my experience, yes. Yeah. No, sorry, they don't get it instantly because they're so not used to it, right? Here's what the challenge is. You go from saying, give me $2 million, I'll be done in 2 years with absolutely every feature you ever wanted. Now, in reality, 2 years later, the thing we're going to deliver, and Bob, you've said this before, right? The thing we're going to deliver is not anything near what they actually thought they were going to get. But the IT department or the R&D or whatever, check's done and we're done. So there's a core issue there. The challenge that the leaders face is you have to get them comfortable with the idea that they're not going to get everything. 90% of which, by the way, they don't even really need. What's the statistic? Like 85% of software features are never even used, right?
Yep.
But you get them from that to saying you're going to get the 2 things that are important to you, or 2 of the things that are important to you in a month, right? Instead of 1,000 features, and then we're gonna iterate. And I've never had anyone say no after having that kind of conversation.
I mean, I think one of the things in the SaMD space, again, a lot of SaMD ends up being patient facing, right? There's a lot of things where, and then by implication, consumer facing out in the wild, right? So, and typically that means you can't train them, you can't force them to use it. It is not a build it and they will come, or they have to come, right? And so that's really different than a medical device that is specifically being used, a surgical tool or something like that. You care about that surgical tool being useful, usable, all of those things. But chances are you don't have 5 million features on this thing. If you do, the same thing applies. Which of those features are actually meaningful and useful? And you have to have the discipline to, one, go figure that out ahead of time, but not do it in some focus group or one big, one formative human factors and you're done. No, you need to actually go through this and validate, the value of these things. Which of these features are you going to use? If I get rid of this feature, would you still use it? All of those things are the kinds of things you need to do to make sure you know what you should be building now, and maybe there are features you have later on. You're going to do those, but that's somewhat different, I think, for most medical device companies. It's standard in when you're building a product outside of the medical device space, where you are getting feedback and rapidly getting feedback. We're used to, one human factors at the beginning, one at the end. I'm exaggerating somewhat, but not the kind of fast feedback iteration to hone in on the details of features and what you should build and shouldn't build.
And human factors is often it's incredibly important, but I also struggled with it relative to the lean startup approach, just because it's a way to optimize what you already want to do, as opposed to asking the question, should I be doing this, and should I be doing this in this way, right? So yeah. It's also the science is advancing. People are, people are smart, right? So people are figuring out how to broaden that human factors out, but it very often, as Bernhard said, it's a check the box exercise before and after, and it's not very useful then.
Quickly, Bob, do you have any parting advice you want to give for somebody who's dropping off at the hour? Like, if nothing else, ...
If nothing else, make sure that you have agreement both above you as well as your peers, as well as the people below you, on what is success.
Great point.
And so if you're using the lean approach, make sure people are in alignment on that, because if it isn't, it will be extremely painful and it will derail progress.
Excellent. So continuing on the conversation, Ron, thank you. And to anybody who has to drop off, thank you very much for joining us. We're continuing to field questions here, though. And I think there's some interesting ones. David, I think what you hit on, I don't know if this is directly related to today's topic, but this has been a point of mine, is in our industry, we seem to treat user experience and human factors as different disciplines, because they answer different questions in our world. And I was shocked when I found out that there are MedTech companies that literally have a human factors department and a user experience department. Because for me, it's all about how's it going for the user, right? But I think in our world, they're designed to answer different questions. Human factors is designed to answer a very specific regulatory question of, given all the parameters I've set up, the intended use and how I've said we're going to train people and who's going to operate it, can somebody successfully use it the way they're supposed to, safely and successfully use it?
Right.
User experience says, would somebody ever choose to do it? Or almost in the world of value-based medicine, will my patient squeeze every last ounce of clinical value out of this device because they want to, because they somehow align between the experience of using it with the value they want to get out of it? And those are very different questions.
It's a gre't point, and I think that I think it's a great way to think about it. I have not thought about it that way, and I think you're spot on. For me, user or patient experience starts with, will they click the damn button, right? Like, what is going to make them start this app, software, whatever it is? What's going to drive them to even do that? And then will they keep using it? I think you're absolutely right. Right, human factors is more of a risk mitigation framework for misuse. It sort of answers the not question. How do I get somebody not to screw up, whereas user experience is more about how do I actually get users to use it, right? To get value from it. So
Right.
yeah, no, I completely agree.
And to me, at least, any professional worrying about the user should be asking both questions, especially in those days.
100%. Well, I think it's you can't. There's it's just a much higher order question, right? The user experience one. Then human factors. Yeah, you want to make sure the colors are right. You want to make sure the button's in the right place. You want to make sure that, you know, the pop-up is expected and that mistakes are, you know, fault tolerant and safe failure modes and lots of other things. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the way we tend to look at that is if we're adopting a lean UX approach, kind of 3 user Thursdays, where we have sort of very frequent feedback from users, and we have this as an ongoing process, right? It exists as a process. Then we have a backlog of different questions and different stimuli we're using to answer those questions. And that includes human factors questions, as well as user experience questions, as well as, frankly, you know, early on, do we even want to invest in this feature or not, right? So those are all the questions that get asked during the process. If you integrate those in, that's the right way of treating human factors, rather than as a, you know, totally separate from the process, the way it is often, and a department that really only comes in every so often to evaluate something, as opposed to organically being integrated into the process.
Different line of questioning. We've gotten a couple questions on this, and so let me pose a two-sided thing for discussion. A question. One is, hey, what about Agile? How does Agile fit into all of this? And particularly, I guess, Agile in a regulated SaMD context. And the second one is, hey, what are the tools that you use to actually manage these kinds of, you know, the activities you're describing? What are there software packages out there? Are there methods? I think those are kind of the two buckets I would put things in. Discuss amongst yourselves.
So,
I mean, at some point, right, some of the activities you may have are kind of, maybe are considered kind of ongoing expenses versus something that is ultimately funded as a capital expense, right? This is something where we are allocating a budget, it's being capitalized, this is product development, we are going to get a product into market, right? And so I think those, at the point where you, let's say you're doing a fundraise to get to a certain milestone, you need to have a decent idea of what it's going to take to get there, right? You may make, and so at that point, your budget number is probably pretty critical to know, probably more critical than, are you going to squeeze all the features in? It's, am I going to, can I get, do I have the runway to get to that milestone? At that point, having clarity on how much this is going to cost is, you know, it's, if you're a startup or if you are a, you know, a department within a large medical device company trying to get a product to market, it's important to have clarity on that, right? At that point, you can't just be iteratively doing things. I think Agile is a good method of reducing all those risks, and you should be, in general, for software, using Agile methods. But that doesn't mean you don't have to do analysis up front to gain clarity on what it is that you're doing.
So, and I think well, where is Agile relative to lean startup? I think, like, when you look at frameworks like SAFe, the scaled Agile framework for enterprise, and opinions vary. I actually think SAFe does a really nice job of blending some of the elements of lean startup and obviously historic agile, and maybe puts in a little too much enterprise-esque stuff. You can argue that, but sometimes that's a sort of a necessary evil. So I wouldn't distinguish them that much. They're all sort of on the continuum, agile to lean to SAFe and so forth. It's more of those basic principles of, chunking things up, hypothesis driven, customer user informed, getting, where I see the difference between sort of lean and let's say Wagile. Wagile can become, meaning waterfall agile, can become very much, hey, I'm going to take my standard waterfall processes and then just pretend to do things 2 weeks at a time, right? And I think that doesn't give you that many benefits. And where I love, what I love about lean startup is that you actually have to get the thing into some kind of use, right? You have to in some way, in a realistic way, test whatever it is that you've built, whether it's getting customer feedback, whether it's actual, whatever, in animal or some way bring reality and therefore reduce the risk to basically zero at every stage. And that to me is the main enabler. I think the challenge obviously in our world is, well, how does that blend with what the regulatory bodies sort of expect and will approve? I honestly think, and I work with FDA on digital health pre-cert. So I have two thoughts on that. I think one, people vastly overestimate the extent to which kind of these regulatory bodies expect waterfall. That's not written anywhere, right? And as long as you can demonstrate high quality and control and so forth, even in an agile way, that's perfectly acceptable. I mean, you still need to do V&V and design controls, but honestly, that's sort of core agile, right? You have to figure out what you're going to build it, test that you did what you did. And so I think there's much more of alignment there than people really understand. The other thing I'll say is that there's no question that the regulatory bodies are moving in a direction that is very much sort of agile, iterative enabled, and we were talking with the orthogonal folks a month or two ago, but and waiting for this PCCP, the pre-configured change protocol, to come out. That came out. I think what you can sense there, and we've heard leaders of the FDA say this explicitly, they're moving to a much more rapid, iterative sort of approval process, which is going to be much more natural in terms of agile. The last thing you mentioned, Randy, and I don't know if you wanted to get into this, but look, Orthogonal has done an amazing job leveraging technology tools and linking them in order to sort of enable agile software as a medical device development, right? Linking Jira, automating protocols, doing all those things. And I don't know if probably the participants don't know, but I basically started a company to bring that level of agile compliance, that's even what we're calling it, right? That level of agile into compliance, from leveraging automation, connecting the various stakeholders that need to get involved, and really just automating and using the nature of software in order to address so many of these kind of quality and regulatory questions in what we hope will be a really transformative way. So I think the tools that enable agile compliance, well, are already being developed by companies like Orthogonal, and I think that's really just the tip of the spear. I think what you'll see is a much more accepting regulatory environment and much more capable tools that really dramatically accelerate digital health innovation.
Bob, let me ask you a question. Company comes to you and says, yeah, we're a sort of a traditional shop. We've done some agile, but somebody's being honest, I'm not sure it's really changed much. We still pretty much are developing the same way. Can that help me with these definition and sizing problems?
So I'm not sure the question you're asking, if I'm going to be 100% honest, but before we go into that, I'll actually respond to the previous conversation because I don't agree.
Good.
So I think the lean startup is a very, very good thing. I think one of the things missing is the social and organizational acceptance of it. If you are a startup, if you're an entrepreneur startup and you're dealing with the investors and you're a small business and your total workforce is 20 people or less, God bless you, you can get away with anything, right? Most of my career, and I grew up in Agile and XP before that in iterative development. Most of my career has been in larger organizations, some with a couple hundred people, some with tens of thousands of people, large companies. And in general, there always has to be some sort of a decision up front. So I'll give you, like, my heritage was I was a software architect. So I'll give you this example. Before you start an agile development project, there are some decisions you have to make architecturally. And this is the heated debate in the agile world. I'm sure it comes up everywhere. And an example is, if I want to choose, am I going to use one database over another? That's a trivial decision. A lot of data people will disagree with me, but the reality is I can swap out databases halfway through a project. It will have an impact, but not a huge detrimental impact. But if I start with Java and I build 2/3 of my application in Java and somebody goes, we're going to switch to .NET or Flutter, that has a freaking huge impact. There's some decisions you need to make from a waterfall approach. My guess is, not my guess, from working with Bernard and Orthogonal, sorry. There are some decisions in SaMD you need to make up front. And pivoting from those decisions is not easy. It is not something that the lean startup or any type of iterative approach, whether it's development or product design, is going to solve, right? And I think calling those things out is really, really critical. In most companies where you're saying, not to pick on you, David, you're saying it's hard to get $2 million from them, but it's easy to get 50K. The question that somebody will inevitably ask is, I'll give you 50K and then I'll give you 100K and then I'll give you 75K. And I see the progress and I see the value. And this is extraordinary. But at the end of the day, it might be the CFO. Somebody's going to want to say, so when are we done? Like, how much money are we talking about? Is this all capitalized or is it an expense, right? All projects are either budgeted through a budget or an allowance. A budget is where somebody defines a pot of money and says, here's your pot of money, work within it. You ain't getting another penny. An allowance is where the company says, here's 7 people. You get these 7 people for the next year or two. Deal with it. You can do whatever you want with them, right? Within certain constraints. And I want you to deliver value. But at the end of the day, if you say I need another 4 people to get over a hump, you got to build a business case. That's not happening. So I gave you an allowance versus a budget. So I think there's some decisions that need to be happening up front, around classification. Like, I don't want to get into the details candidly, because then we're going to get into hows and we're going to go down into the rabbit hole. But there's certain decisions that need to be made up front. I'll stop there after I've antagonized my
I know.
peers.
You're lucky that you're on the other side of no. Well, but I first of all, I agree with probably 95% of everything you said. I'm gonna work backwards because this is really key, right? You're absolutely right that the CFO will always ask, what is the total investment and how much am I going to make? And that's why it is important to have, some innovation funding, innovation budget to start to bootstrap, to start to create the evidence, to create the business case, to have the proof points, to increase the investment, to do all that. But it is the lean startup that lets you sort of get on that journey. And what happens from my experience is your coalition of the willing grows, right? And you start getting more and more people that eventually you don't even have that final decision by the CFO. It just is what it is. You have 20 people doing this. They're making a couple of $1 million. Why would you stop it? And you're going. I would even say, but at the same time, I 100% agree with you that there is a structural foundation that needs to remain very consistent and constant, right? You're using AWS, you're using whatever it is. Like if that foundation upon which you are innovating and iterating is changing, you can't have that. So, and those large enterprise decisions are big, large enterprise decisions that you need to put in place. But I would, but not all, even the big IT project decisions are large enterprise decisions. So for example, right, we probably did a dozen 10 or $50 million 2-3 year IT projects. Hey, here's a new regulatory system, new legal system, new this, new that. By the time, so I drove the implementation of lean startup in that. We took a $10 million project, and yeah, it wasn't 50K, but we said, give us 250K and we will give you these 2 or 3 features, functions from this. It was happened to be a regulatory project. And what happened after that initial 250K investment, we realized we need to completely change vendors, which we would have never realized. We would have spent the $10 million, we would have been locked in for 3, 4, or 5 years and would have had a crappy solution. And so that's why I'm saying this. There are so many places, not everywhere, but there are so many places where lean startup can get you to reduce your risk, get to value faster, and actually build the organizational alignment. But you're absolutely right, Bob, not everywhere.
Yep. That's all I was saying. I think it has its place. Discovery, proof of concept, lean startup takes that and pours fuel on it.
Yeah. So we don't have to rumble by the bike racks now.
Yeah.
Really, the key part is sort of having the wisdom, as the prayer goes, to know which are the things you have to deal with up front and essentially lock, and which are the ones you don't, and the wisdom to know the difference, right?
Right.
Yeah. And I think that's, I mean, different types of organizations have sort of are more adapted or less adapted to this, right? I've seen, for example, lots of pharma SaMD projects, right, where it's driven by the commercial group, and they're not a product development group. They've not, the disciplines around that are not there. So you very often end up with these, well, we need all these features, all of these features, and they end up sort of taking a long time and a lot of money to build those features, and they haven't gone and sort of tested that with anyone, right? They've not gotten out of the building until they build this big behemoth, and lo and behold, it doesn't do what it needs to do. It doesn't resonate, and they just wasted $30 million. Whereas even if the core of that idea was right, the ability to quickly and iteratively get to the point where you have de-risked it so that whatever the bigger things you are building are the right things to build, right?
At the end of the day, here's what I'd throw out, and I'd be very curious about Bernard tearing this one apart just for some personal reasons. If you want to start product definition, specifically definition, and you want to get going, so you aren't really figuring out, is this the right approach? Why? Because you have a product vision. You have your regulatory strategy, right? You've actually defined a technical architecture approach that you believe you've used the lean approach to come up with these things. These are the what's that you really need to be able to move forward. That would be, like, to answer your question very directly, Randy, having the wisdom to know what needs to be up front. Now, you could say, but I want to revisit these all the way through. But if I'm a third or 2/3 through the project and I'm revisiting some of that stuff, that has a huge cost and impact. I'm not saying it's wrong to do, but I'm saying the more you can do your discovery and your lean startup approach to produce those types of things, the vision, the regulatory strategy, etc. I could list out 5 things. Then the less redo later on you will have that will be extraordinarily painful.
So you can use these techniques of testing up front to nail down the key things you have to, and then you just keep using them for all the detail as you get into it.
Correct. Absolutely. So the process I don't disagree with. I just think saying like we can use it everywhere isn't always appropriate.
So I would say, accepting those constraints, this is probably a really good breaking point rather than squeezing the last 8 minutes out. It feels like we've bundled some really good content, and we have some alignment here among our speakers. So I think before that breaks, I'm gonna let it go. But I want to say to the audience, thank you very much. I hope we got to your questions. If we didn't, feel free to reach out. If you have thoughts on this or other topics you'd like to hear, either a follow-on to this session or other sessions, we are always looking for good topics from our audience because you're the ones attending. And I'm actually really pleased to see that we're at 83 minutes in, we're still at over 40% of the attendees who logged in at the beginning. So thank you all for spending the time with us.
And thank you
we'll,
for talking about
call it
putting it
close.
together.
Yeah. Thanks, David and Bob and Randy. Enjoyed the conversation. And thanks for everyone's questions.
Yeah, thank you all for your time, for joining us.
All right.
Take care. You all. Bye.
Bye-bye.